Good morning again. Thank you, Angela, sharing that. That really is an exceptionally good book. If you really want to read a good history of the Underground Railroad, I really recommend Bordewич's book, Bound for Canaan. It really is extremely well done. So, as I said earlier, this is our annual marking celebration of Juneteenth, which, of course, as I said, took place on Thursday. Before I begin, I guess I am obligated to say something about the news. And boy, it's whenever I do, it's never something good, it feels like. So, as I'm sure you all know, bombs were dropped yesterday. American bombs were dropped on Iran. And I guess my first reaction is, I have no love for the Iranian regime. They're ruled by a group of folks who are not great people. And but I also know that dropping bombs in war in general is just not the answer. And especially it feels like an opportunity and a possibility where negotiation was actually already successfully done under a couple of presidents ago and then scuttled by the current president. And here we are. And now people have died and the risks are rising. And I'm feeling very sad today and very much feeling that I'm not sure what we can do, but that we all need to pray and meditate for peace. And in case you don't know this, we have a peace pole in this congregation very near the Edgewood Lane doors. And I'm planning a service in the fall where about peace, and we'll sort of rededicate that peace pole then. But if you want to spend a few moments at that pole today, perhaps on your way out the door, maybe saying a brief prayer, I certainly invite you to do so. So back to the Underground Railroad and Juneteenth. I hope you all were able to get something out of that Clint Smith videos. He talks kind of fast, I know, a little soft-spoken, but when I watched that interview, I was like, these are themes that I'm really going to be touching on during the sermon today, and not seeing Juneteenth abolition of the Underground Railroad as being an opportunity to cheer on white saviors, but rather white allies. And of course, that the movement was led by people of color, and that the most courageous people in the Underground Railroad were the fugitive enslaved people themselves. And I think that's a lesson that we not only need to know about the Underground Railroad, but in all of the work, the justice work that we do today, our anti-racism work, our social justice work. It's easy to develop, and I'll say this again later in the sermon, but it's easy to get a bit of a puffed up attitude about, look at the good deeds I'm doing. But those deeds are important, but they're not the only or even the most important actions. So no matter how many of the testimonials and stories I read about the Underground Railroad, stories about enslaved people making the courageous decision to run away rather than enduring one more day in bondage, or seeing or fearing themselves and their families being ripped apart and sold to the highest bidder. Stories about free Blacks in the North who risked their lives and their freedom to help those who were running away. And yes, stories about white allies who offered food and shelter and other forms of assistance. No matter how many of these stories I read, I can't help but always be amazed and in awe of the courage and commitment of those who joined together to struggle for freedom and justice along the Underground Railroad, a movement that was illegal, that would have led to arrest and beatings, perhaps worse than that, with slave catchers roaming the streets of the North, sneaking up on people, no accountability. Where does this sound familiar? Let's think for a moment about the story of Edward Walker that Angela shared. Here's an enslaved human being who, from a young age, thirsted for freedom. When circumstances changed and his owner decided to sell him, which would make any future escape virtually impossible, Walker made the decision to run away and seek freedom in the North. Now, even before he and his brother carried out their bold plan, they received help from another enslaved person who risked their life to make contact with a conductor on the Underground Railroad. After what must have been an arduous and terrifying journey to the banks of the Ohio River, a journey in which, again, capture would have certainly meant brutal physical punishment, perhaps even death, Walker and his brother made it across to Cincinnati. Now, because, as I said a minute ago, slave catchers and their informants were all over free states like Ohio, Walker and his family remained hidden and received help from station masters and conductors who provided food and shelter and transportation. They spent a week hidden by a free Black family before receiving transportation north by a white conductor. Eventually, Walker's journey led to Detroit, where he then boarded a ferry for Canada and freedom. And I followed up on Walker's story. He became a very, very successful and prosperous businessman in Canada. Now, what is perhaps most remarkable about stories like Edward Walker's is just how common they were in the decades leading up to the Civil War. All across what was then the United States, fugitive slaves were following the drinking Gourd and making their way north to freedom. And as they made that courageous journey, they encountered and received help from friends and allies, both Black and white, who were part of a movement that was loosely organized and very, very secret. A movement that chose to confront injustice rather than remaining complacent or looking the other way. A movement that, above all else, affirmed the words upon which this nation was founded, but which had and often continues to be ignored. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. Now, I want to take a moment now to tell you another story that I learned about the Underground Railroad. This is a story of two extraordinary men, two heroes who lived in the same small town along the Ohio River in Ohio. These two men were John Parker and a white minister named John Rankin. Now, I first learned about Parker and Rankin when I visited the National Underground Railroad Museum and Freedom Center in Cincinnati some years ago. John Parker spent the first 18 years of his life enslaved. After several failed attempts to escape, his skills as a blacksmith enabled him to earn enough money to purchase his freedom, and he eventually settled in the same small town that John Rankin lived in. He owned a foundry and raised a family. But for John Parker, freedom wasn't simply the opportunity to earn a living or raise a family. Freedom was a responsibility and a calling to help others to share in that freedom. Parker served as one of the most courageous, determined, and daring conductors on the Underground Railroad. Night after night, he would get in a boat and journey back across the Ohio River into the slave state of Kentucky, a tremendous risk for him. By his own count, he helped some 400 enslaved people make it to freedom. And he did this at great personal risk and lived for many years with a bounty on his head. Now, those fugitives that Parker helped across the river often found their way to the home of Reverend John Rankin. In fact, Rankin's house stood high above the Ohio River, and every night his wife Jean would light a candle and leave it burning in a window that faced the river. That candle in the Rankin home served as a beacon of safety, freedom, and hope and was one of the single most important stations along the Underground Railroad. Now, one of the things I find most compelling about John Rankin is the connection he drew between his faith and his activism. Now, Rankin was not a Unitarian or a Universalist. He was a Presbyterian minister and an evangelical Christian. In fact, there's a quote somewhere where he said something about those wacky, not wacky, but Universalists. He didn't get them at all. So wacky is not really a 19th century term. But John Rankin believed fervently that the Christian scriptures, the Christian Bible, was a command to treat all people as children of God. He especially found strength and inspiration in a passage that abolitionists frequently looked to and recited from the book of Acts in the New Testament, which simply says, "Out of one blood, God created all people to dwell upon the face of the earth." Now, as much as I admire Rankin's theology and his reading of the Bible, what sets people like him and John Parker and Harriet Tubman and all who risked their lives and their livelihoods on the Underground Railroad was their commitment to action. It is one thing to talk about or to preach about loving one's neighbor or to affirm principles like freedom and justice for all, as we do here in Unitarian Universalism. But what matters most is not what we profess, but how we live those principles and values, and what we are willing to do and to risk in bringing them into being. That is one lesson we must learn from the Underground Railroad and embody in our personal lives and in the life of this congregation. And as the experience of the Underground Railroad illustrates so well, the work of justice must always be collaborative and relational and begin from a place of humility, not self-righteousness or self-congratulation. While history often remembers the exploits of white activists like John Rankin, the true leaders of the Underground Railroad were the formerly enslaved fugitives themselves and conductors like John Parker and Harriet Tubman, whose courage and commitment brought the Underground Railroad into being. Now, that's not to suggest or to diminish the role of allies like John Rankin, and not to say they didn't play an important role. But what I find so remarkable and instructive about Rankin and others like him is that they acted as allies rather than saviors, followers rather than as leaders. Rankin and other white allies built relationships of trust and equality across what historian Fergus Bordewich calls a free zone of interracial activity. Rather than assuming that he had all the answers or that others should inevitably or naturally follow his lead, Rankin listened, learned, and saw how he could best serve the cause of freedom and justice, and then had the courage to act. For John Rankin and other white allies, activism is not something he did for others. Activism was something he did with others. Social justice isn't something that congregations like this do for other people. It's something we do with other people. Now, I must say that this understanding of justice as action-oriented and collaborative is one that does not always come easy, including in Unitarian Universalism. I wish I could tell you that many white Unitarians and Universalists played equally important roles in the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad, and did so from that same place of humility and equality that John Rankin did. And there are, of course, Unitarians and Universalists who did play important roles in the abolitionist movement. And there were some who did display that same sort of allyship that John Rankin did. One remarkable person was a minister at the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia named William Henry Furness. I think I've got his picture here. who Sunday after Sunday, year after year, courageously denounced slavery from his pulpit, denunciations that did not make him very popular, including with some in his own congregation. His name was even sent to the federal government to be investigated. Nothing came of it. But in addition to talking, Furness himself also served as a station. His home in Philadelphia was a station along the Underground Railroad. That's a heroic and courageous story, and one that we certainly ought to tell over and over again. But here's the other side. More often than not, our Unitarian forebears, and I know a bit more about them than the Universalists, failed to speak out or take action. Or if they did it, I'm sorry to say, from a place of arrogance and racial superiority. So I'm about to go after a couple of saints. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, in some of his writings, celebrated the superiority of Anglo-white stock and made reference to the inherent racial inferiority of African Americans in explaining why slavery still existed. Blame the victim, right? Similar arguments were made by Emerson's contemporary, the celebrated abolitionist and Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, whose words I cite from time to time, and who was the first person to actually articulate the idea that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Timeless words, right? That Dr. King made famous. Parker, who articulated those words and who was a very active abolitionist, he saw no contradiction in opposing slavery while at the same time claiming that African Americans were that poorest of human creatures, satisfied with slavery, spending more time eating sugarcane and playing the banjo. So why don't, spoken like somebody had no idea what he was talking about. Well, why don't the slaves just get up and leave? Well, easy for you to say, right? So it must be because they're lazy. They don't have any ambition, right? Remember, Emerson and Parker were the radical white humanitarians of their day. Now, building relationships among equals rather than assuming we have all the answers or that we must save them, that's still a challenge in Unitarian Universalism. It's so much easier to preach a sermon, sing a hymn, or sign a petition. And don't get me wrong, those things are important. Signing petitions, signing postcards. Where's Ellie? Ellie, I love petitions and postcards. This is not a criticism at all. But those are first steps, and Ellie, I think, would agree with that. So many who worked as part of the Underground Railroad, as they learned, getting out of one's comfort zone and building relationships across barriers of bias, stereotype, privilege, that's essential and the only truly effective way of bringing about meaningful change. And as Rankin and Furness, John Parker and Harriet Tubman all experienced, those relationships in that interracial zone of freedom, those relationships can be powerful and life-changing, not only for those on the margins, but powerful and life-changing for each and every one of us. Let me just conclude by saying that I am so hopeful and so inspired by the direction that our congregation is moving in as we are beginning, at the very beginning of starting to build what I think will become those kinds of transformative relationships across all of those barriers, physical and invisible, that keep us apart. We're doing wonderful work with organizations like Sin Barreras and City of Promise. We're starting to build relationships with the Black community in Charlottesville and the Latinx community in Charlottesville. I'm pleased to share as well, and this is something I haven't talked about yet, that been in some really productive conversations with the new executive director at FAR, the Public Housing Associates of Residents, who has invited us to play an active role in the West Haven Community Day, which is coming up in early August. I've got a flyer hanging up out there. There's the flyer there. And I'm volunteering. I'm hoping many of us will volunteer. This is a wonderful way to show up. And, showing up to do whatever. Hand out water. I'm sure it'll be a hot day. Whatever. But just to say, hey, we're here. We're here to pitch in. We're here to help. And this is something that I've been joined the planning committee along with Ann Salamini, who's out there somewhere, and Edith Good. There's Ann. And Edith, of course, is injured right now, but is most certainly with us in spirit. So if you're interested in volunteering, you can scan that QR code. There's one outside, just outside these doors as well. So I hope that you all want to see a really good turnout from our congregation. So let me just wrap up by saying that I don't know if we'll ever see another social movement in this country quite like the Underground Railroad. The courage, the dedication, the commitment to justice, they were incredible. But I do know that if we can learn and come to embody the lessons of that movement, everyone in this room will make a positive difference. We've got to act with boldness, courage, and an unfailing dedication to freedom and justice. We've also got to listen and to learn. We've got to take the time to build relationships rooted in trust and love. If we can do that, we can have both courage and humility, commitment and love. I think we can play a part, maybe a small part, but not an insignificant part, in a renewed movement for freedom and justice, a movement that brings people together to build a better world, a movement that we so desperately need in these troubled times, a movement that will flow like a beautiful, beautiful river, affirming that all people are somebody precious, somebody beautiful, and somebody deserving of freedom and justice. Blessed be and amen.